Dear students, I'm going to talk about the use of French language and literature in the Middle English period. I hope and expect that by the end of this session, you would be able to understand the significance of the use of French language during the Middle English language period, and you would also understand how did it influence the English language in the coming times. Well, as a matter of fact, the use of French was predominantly done by the upper class of England. The members of the new ruling class, they were sufficiently predominantly using their own language, and because these were the people who were the Normans, these were the people who brought French with them, so naturally French was used. And actually, for the next 200 years, this continued happening. After 200 years of the Norman conquest, still French remained the language of people. It remained the language of the ordinary people, and it was the language of people for everyday conversations, for everyday ordinary intercourse, especially among the people of the upper class. The question arises, my dear students, how did French get this coin? How did it spread? Well, it spread through intermarriages because the nobility of the times, the upper class people of those times of England, they married into the Norman families and the English families, thus making these intermarriages common. Association with the ruling class, numerous people of English extraction found it to their advantage to learn French. Well, I would explain this point that because people always, as a matter of fact, in every civilization, they want to climb up the ladder that is both social and political. So the people who wanted to be associated with the upper class, those who wanted to be known as belonging to the upper class, they were the people who started using French. I would like to make this point clear that this distinction was not ethnic. So, it was not that a person who would belong to, the Norman part of the world, these would be the people who would only use French language, and the others from the island would use English. The distinction was more social than ethnic, which means the more you would belong to the upper class, the more were the chances that you would use French. Now comes the question, what was the language of the masses? Well, the language of the masses was English. These were the people who were ruled. They were ruled by whom? The Norman people after the Norman conquest. The language of the rulers was French, but the language of the ruled, that is the common people, was English. So, as an example, I would say a French soldier settled on a manor with a few hundred English peasants would soon learn the language of the people among whom his lot was cast. So as he would live with them, he would soon learn the English language that would be spoken by these people. An instructive parallel that we can draw between these bilingual choices is that of the example of Belgium. Here we find Flemish and French. Both the languages are spoken side by side in Belgium. So same was happening, you see, in the England of the Middle English times, where people were using French and English side by side. There was this upper class that was using French. There was this lower class or the middle class, the masses, who were using English. And both the languages coexisted and survived. As is, in comparison, we can see the case of Flemish and of the French language that are surviving in Belgium together and side by side. There is an important point, and that is, what were the circumstances that promoted the continued use of French? Well, it was until the beginning of the 13th century that the close connection of the upper class between England and the continent kept on happening. Now, what was happening? These people would continuously travel from time to time, from England to their origin. And they would have their properties in both the areas, they would have their relatives in both the areas. So these both languages would go on together and side by side. English kings spent their time there. The conqueror and his sons were in France for about half of their respective reigns. So, they were living in France more than in England. And the result was that the royalty naturally continued using French language. Same was the case with the nobility. Now, if the royal family, that is the most upper ladder, was using, French language, naturally the lower ladders would also use that. So the nobility who was surrounding these rulers, the king, they would use that as well. The English nobility was an Anglo-French aristocracy. They had possessions in the continent. They would frequently have contacts. They would have marriages, and would keep on traveling from one of these areas to the other. Also, to please the court and the nobility, naturally, all the literature that was written in these times, it was heavily influenced by French. And my dear students, it was only towards the later half of the Middle English period that there was a gradual shift to literature that was written in English because there were changes in the political setup.